And today we are joined by the illustrious Dr. Charles Hunt. He goes by Charlie. Charlie, great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from the great state of Idaho.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. I don't know if I've ever been called illustrious before. We'll see if I can live up to it.
Well, you've got a mustache, you've got a great map. I feel like we're really matching today, so
We
it
are.
just can't go
We're on
wrong.
brand here.
Yeah. Well, so Charlie is the assistant professor at Boise State University. He is holds a PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland in College Park, and a BA in poli sci or political science. Those long-winded among you from the Brown University. Uh, Thank you so much for being here, Charlie. I just have to start by asking, like, how did you get into politics? I mean, you obviously went to college and you found it. Did you know before, or did you find it in college? Give us a little bit of the Charlie story.
Yeah, it's a good question. How does anybody get into politics? When I was in high school, so I was born and raised in Rhode Island.
Okay.
I'm the only Rhode Islander that most people in the Intermountain West have ever met, and I'm proud of that. I grew up in Rhode Island, went to high school there, and during that time developed both a an interest in American history. I was one of those kids who was like reading books about the founding fathers. And I was also really interested in writing. It was something I felt like it was one of the things I felt like I was good at academically from an early age. And so I got to college and I really wasn't that interested in politics. I wasn't like, there were kids in my high school class who were really into politics and everyone kind of thought they were weirdos. And now I don't think they were. But, I got to college and this was in 2007 going into 2008. And so this was a very sort of significant time in American politics. It was, the kind of Obama wave. And that level of interest in the 2008 election combined with some courses I took that sort of confirmed that poli sci was a nice middle ground between like English, like my desire to be the next great American novelist on the one hand, and American history on the other hand. Poli sci was sort of a practical happy medium between those two. And the more I studied it, the more I got into it. I decided to be a poli sci major. And this was at Brown, which is also in Rhode Island. Graduated and ended up actually as it being a political consultant for a few years
Okay.
after being an undergraduate, and that was a very revealing experience, especially in Rhode Island state politics, and
Okay.
confirmed a lot of the things I did want to do and didn't want to do going forward. So that's sort of how I got into the racket.
That's fascinating. So did you grow up in Providence?
I grew up about 20 minutes north of Providence. I mean,
Okay.
nothing in Rhode Island is that far from Providence. Like, you can go end to end in like an hour in Rhode Island, so it's not. But yeah, I mean, certainly around Providence. And I grew up, I don't know if your listeners have ever heard of Buddy Cianci, but in like the Buddy Cianci days, he was this former, like, super corrupt mayor of Providence, kind of with a thick accent and everything like that. If you ever talk to my dad, he's got the thick Rhode Island accent. And so that's my fun story.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is one of those states where even more so than the flyover states, like you never really hear anything about Rhode Island, right? Like Delaware's got all the corporations, Connecticut, has all the insurance.
Yeah.
What's going on in Rhode Island? What is going on in Rhode Island? Do you have a synopsis for us?
A lot of great Italian food.
Okay, there you go.
We've got I currently live in what you know those dang coastal elites would call a flyover state, but Rhode Island is sort of a drive-through state. Whenever I say Rhode Island, people are like, "Oh yeah, I drove through there on the way between Boston and New York." It's like, yeah,
Uh,
that's pretty typical. We've got great beaches. We've got beautiful forestry. We've got some great cities and towns, and some really interesting politics and political history, which I was really interested in. Providence is an awesome city. This is just like, I'm not being paid by the city of Providence to say this, but like it's a really great city, a good alternative. If like me, you like having the amenities of a decent sized city, but
Yeah.
feel really overwhelmed and claustrophobic when you go to New York.
Yeah.
And Boise is kind of the same way. They're about this.
Mm,
Boise and Providence are about the same size. So I ended up in like the Providence of the Intermountain West or Pacific Northwest.
nice. Well, I was just, you probably saw me. I was looking over here. I was like, man, where did Rhode Island come from? Like, where was that name? Because I went to Rhodes College, Rhodes,
Hmm.
which also is spelled similarly to Rhode
Yeah.
Island, um, but is named after like a cousin of Cecil Rhodes, kind of a thing, an old president of the university. But it looks like not related. It's like an old Italian explorer named it after the Greek island of Rhodes because it looked the same. Does that sound
Yeah,
right to you?
that sounds familiar to me. It's not that like compelling of a story. I mean, whenever I say a lot of times when I say Rhode Island, people think I mean Long Island in New York,
Yeah.
which is always unfortunate. But it's fun to correct people sometimes. So yeah, we've got our maps, so we can at least. I mean,
Yeah,
maybe we can't see it, but
it is
in
tiny. Well, it's not actually an island either,
no,
right? It's a
not at all.
peninsula at best.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a couple of islands, little islands within it,
Okay,
but
there
the
you go.
state itself is not an island. Where I grew up was northern Rhode Island, right on the Massachusetts border. The way I like to
Okay.
say it is, the Dunkin' Donuts I worked at in high school was like a 10-minute walk away, and it was in Massachusetts. So,
Wow.
give you an idea of how
That's
close
so
everything is.
wild. That's so wild. I
Yeah,
so I grew up in um, a bedroom community of Houston, Texas. So, I mean, first of all, you had to drive everywhere.
yeah.
Houston, not a great city, and they're not paying me to paying me to say that. Um, but it has kind of the overwhelming oppression of a giant city, and none of the walkability of the East Coast cities.
Yeah. I mean, if I were gonna live somewhere on the East Coast again, I would want to live in Providence, and not just because my
That's
family is there,
nice.
and potentially watching.
uh, well, okay. So you made it from Rhode Island, and then you decide to go down to Maryland. So what was did that? How did that fall? What was that? Just
Yeah.
kind of you took a couple years. You were doing the consulting thing, and you were like, maybe not, and then you went for the PhD.
Yeah, so I did 3 years as a political consultant, and it was a good job, and the people I worked with were great.
Yeah.
It was a political consulting and lobbying firm, and it's not that I didn't feel good about some of the work I was doing. I liked the clients that we had and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
and I learned a lot of important skills around, especially in terms of state politics, around political communication and how to build a coalition and try to get things done, and then some other things that I was less wild about, sort of the fundraising side and especially like I love elections. I'm an elections nerd through and
Mm,
through. But whenever we got to sort of election season, it would be a lot of fundraising and shaking hands in the same conversation 5,000 times. And so that I wasn't as wild about. But that the thing I can say for that job is I learned a lot, and it taught me that I did definitely want to do politics, but that I was maybe better off sort of behind the computer screen doing original research. I had some like nascent ideas of what I might want to do for research, and I like to read books, I like to do all that stuff, and the consulting thing, there were parts of it I was good at, parts of it I wasn't. And so I decided to go to grad school, if for nothing else, to sort of figure things out. I did not
mm.
know at the time, even, that I had any interest in being a college professor. But I knew University of Maryland. It's where my mom went, and it's just outside of like it's basically right in Washington, D.C., right off the
Yep.
Green Line there. And that seemed like the right place for me to be, like right in the belly of the beast, studying the institutions like Congress and the presidency that I knew I was interested in. And so it seemed like the right move. I applied some other places, but Maryland was where I ended up. So I am to this day a proud Terrapin. And I did that for 5 years to get my PhD. I wasn't even necessarily planning on finishing at the time. I was like, I'll get my master's and then get the heck out. But um, I it turned out I fell in love with research, and here I am.
Nice. Well, that's great. So I think we must have overlapped. I was in DC from 20 let's see, 2014 to 17. So
Yeah,
we
I was
were
there
we
that
were
whole
there at the
time.
same time.
So maybe
Man,
we, you know,
we may have even bumped into each other. Well,
yeah,
cool. So you've got we have a Substack, which we'll get to, but first you have a book,
I do.
Home Field Advantage: Roots, Reelection, and Representation in the Modern Congress. And I have to say, I'm a serious nerd about this word representation, and so to see it in the byline of a book, I was like, oh, this is gonna go well.
I live and breathe representation, Walter.
That is
We're on the
awesome.
same wavelength.
Okay, very cool. So yeah, so tell me or tell us about the book. It seems like this is kind of for a popular-ish audience. What's the gist? Give us the pitch.
Yeah, this was the book that was based on my dissertation that I wrote when I was getting my PhD. I had it as sort of a partial book by the time I finished my degree, and then added a few chapters and finished it up in my first couple years out here at Boise State once I got this job. And the premise of this book and the origins for it is actually it's a piece of political science, a classic piece of political science that I assign lots of my students that I read in college, called Home Style by Richard Fenno. And this book it's almost 50 years old. It was written in 1978. And it was, this political scientist who's old school basically went and visited with a dozen or so members of Congress in their districts and observed them in their districts. Like, he almost didn't care what was
Uh,
going on in Washington. He was like, I'm going to go see these people. I was going to say these guys. It was almost all guys at that time.
yeah,
What they're doing in their districts. What are the relationships that matter for them? And like, how do they each represent their districts in different kinds of ways? Because obviously someone who represents a black member of Congress representing like Harlem is going to do so probably in a very different way than like a white Republican representing like rural West Iowa or something.
yeah.
And that's okay. There are all different types of representation. But what I latched onto in that book was that some of these members of Congress, and then I saw this in the modern Congress as well, some of these members had really deep ties in their particular districts, in their regions of the country, right? They were born and raised there. They were these like sixth generation, right? Born and bred, went to high school there, had a sort of authentic local identity and local knowledge of their particular community that they represented. And then
Mhm.
other members of Congress, both in that book and in the modern Congress, they're, what in the 19th century were derisively referred to as carpetbaggers, right? They would sort of parachute in from somewhere else
Mhm.
and maybe with good intentions, right? But to run for office in a particular place, even if they had no like background, like authentic biographical background or experience in that district. And so, throughout grad school, I was thinking about all the different types of representation or different types of, actions that would produce in a member of Congress. I started collecting data, looked at, where they were born, where they went to high school, where they went to college, postgraduate, whether they owned a local business in the district. And I created this index. I call it this local roots index of how locally rooted each member of Congress is in their districts. And it's, for the statistics nerds out there, the modern Congress, it's basically a bell curve, a normal distribution, right? The
Uh,
average member of Congress like has some connections, but not a ton of connections. And then a few members of Congress are like total carpetbaggers; they have no connections. And then a few members of Congress are like the really born and bred types in their districts. And
yeah.
so the goal here was to sort of learn about the effect that those kinds of roots had on elections for members who did have them and members who didn't have them.
Okay, so what I heard you say was you took the book Homestyle by Richard Fenno and
Yeah.
you applied research and data and statistics to try to kind of bear it out, see what this old guy's gut instinct, see how it played out in the modern world.
Yeah, I mean, especially because, I mean, as you know, Walter, like Congress is very different now than it was 50 years ago in many different ways, right?
Yeah.
This book, Homestyle, was written at a time where we sort of had, like, it was a period of low partisanship, right? You had a lot of overlap between the two parties, very little polarization compared to today. And whereas today, right, you've got, this phenomenon that's commonly referred to as political nationalization, right? That we are the sort of electoral fates of, say, the average Republican member of Congress and President Trump are more tightly linked now than, an average Republican member of Congress in, the early 1980s and Ronald Reagan. That we are judging, that voters are evaluating and judging members of Congress and state legislators and like city councilors for that matter, more and more by the same metrics that they are judging the president. And they want to know where you stand on national issues and all this stuff. And so basically I wanted to explore like whether there was any room at all for this kind of localized biographical representation that didn't have to adhere to one party or the other. Like one of the findings of my book is that like there are Democrats who are really locally tied and Democrats who are not. And there are Republicans who are really locally tied and Republicans who are not. This is like not a partisan issue in any way. And that these kinds of local ties, like whether or not I was born and raised here, shouldn't say anything one way or the other about like whether I'm liberal or conservative or whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat. And so theoretically, it's something that all constituents can like and relate to. And that was part of the finding in my book.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate the application of data to big ideas. Sounds like that's what you've done here. And did you find that people with the deep roots, the deep ties, did kind of have this home field advantage?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not only that, I mean, I found like I collected not just data about, I mean, the subtitle is The Modern Congress, but I also collected data about the, Congress going back to like the 1940s and, members' birthplaces and all things like that, and compared across time basically what this home field advantage was in like the 40s through the 70s and then the 80s through the 90s and then the 2000s through the present. And it's been fairly consistent on the whole that generally what I found was that members of Congress who have really deep ties in their district compared to members that are more these sort of carpetbagger types, they run anywhere between, the estimate is sort of broad, but anywhere between like 6 to 8 percentage points ahead of those without those ties. And single digits, right? This is not like the motivating factor for voters, but in an environment where a lot of races are, won or lost by just a few points, in an environment where we have this steep partisanship and polarization and nationalized elections, that kind of thing can make a difference. And what's unique about it to me is that it helps in the general election and it helps in primaries. So it helps with diehard voters in your own party, like incumbents, members of Congress who are running for re-election, in a primary. The ones with really deep roots, they almost never attract a primary challenger. But the ones who don't have deep roots, they get primary challengers a lot more often, like more than twice as often as these folks with deep roots. And so it's something you want to have, right? It's an electoral asset It's
Mm.
not the biggest one, right? It's not the same as like being a Republican in Idaho. Like that's going to be a big advantage for you compared to being a Democrat, or vice
Uh-huh.
versa, like being a Democrat
Yeah.
in Rhode Island. It's
Yeah.
not bigger than partisanship, but it can cut across partisanship in ways that I think even I wasn't really expecting. And so that was a pretty interesting finding.
Well, it's also interesting, kind of in the era of modern transportation, right? I'll just say, kind of post, 19 post World War II. I think
Yeah.
is perhaps a accurate time frame. You know, families were more mobile. Everyone's moving here and there and the other place, and so in a lot of ways, there's been this decoupling of the family lineage and being rooted in one place. um, but it seems like it still matters for if you're going to represent a place to have been from there. I mean, what common sense that makes, but um, to see it borne out, I mean, I think is it's in some ways reassuring, right? It's like the people do actually still pay attention to that and care. That actually feels kind of nice.
I totally agree. The reason I think one reason I've been able to sustain myself, like my mental health in my academic career, given all
Yeah,
the craziness of politics of the last like 10, 15 years that I've sort of been in the game, is
yeah.
that I found something I really care about and that kind of motivates me personally and normatively. Like, I think on the whole that this local roots, local ties stuff is a good thing. I think it's representation kind of the way the founders intended it.
Yep.
In my book, I'm quoting James Madison here and there talking about like they need like members of Congress are going to be needing direct, sympathy with the people, and that they do that by being with them and knowing them. And they can
Mm.
do that more authentically if they were born and raised in a place. And it gets back to sort of the founder's vision for what especially the House of Representatives would look like. That
Mm.
they were counting on the fact that like the reason we don't do national elections for Congress is that we have this suspicion that the interests of the people in, Idaho's second congressional district where I am are probably pretty different in a lot of ways in terms of the economy and industries and jobs and like culture and all of these things and the environment than someone representing Miami, Florida, right? That like these are different parts of the country, they have different needs, and these local voices need to go to Congress, make those needs known, and then find a way to get those interests into policy. And
Mm.
that's becomes a lot harder to do if you've got a bunch of members of Congress who have no authentic knowledge of the place that they're representing, if they're just going there for like a good political opportunity.
Yeah.
And so it's something, it doesn't come without its issues, right? Like a lot deep appreciation for local ties can kind of veer into like nativism or like we don't like any outsiders and stuff like that,
Yeah.
especially if you're talking about a lot of like looking back in the 60s and 70s, especially a lot of these southern districts, there was still a lot of big problems in terms of like racial resentment and viewing them as outsiders and things like that, and immigration is a whole issue. But on the
Yeah.
whole, this is a facet of representation that I think is actually a really good thing, and so that helps me keep going with the academic work, even 4 years after I published the book.
Yeah. When you've got a second edition coming out.
Not just yet, but I
Oh,
do want
that's
to.
the
Well,
of
because
your
I would like
textbook
to.
of your textbook.
Yeah, the my textbook Congress Explained, which I co-authored with my two actually friends from grad school who both went to University of Maryland, Casey Burgett, who is a professor at George Washington University in DC,
Mm.
and Sorrel Gaynor, who is at University of Virginia now. I co-authored that with them, and we had a second edition of that last year. But
Nice.
with Home Field Advantage, I would like to extend the work, update the data. Like I only have it going up through the 2020 election, but I would like to do the sort of Fenno style deep casework of like going to these districts myself and observing
Mm.
and doing the qualitative research rather than just the quantitative. I think this kind of research really calls for it. So
Yeah,
I'll just
you
need a
can do
few big grants first.
yeah, I was gonna say you can do the update on Finno's work for 2030.
I mean, that's the dream. I mean,
Yeah.
that's been my like secret, goal that I've been harboring basically since I was in grad school. But got to
Okay.
get some money
Well,
first. We'll see.
yeah. Well, it doesn't seem like money and politics are decoupling of all the trends.
No,
It does not
no,
does not appear that that is the case.
no.
Um, okay, so then I've got maybe the hardest question, which is
Oh boy.
can you define representation for me?
Woof. Oh, I mean, it's the word I think about the most in my research.
Okay.
Um, I would say, I mean, representation to me is uh, sort of faithfully doing right by your constituents as you understand it. It doesn't mean you're always going to do a great job. Like being a really good representative does not mean you're always going to do what your constituents want. It does not always mean that you are going to be popular. In fact, sometimes I think being a good representative means not being popular. But I think to me, good representation is having a sort of a genuine desire to do right by your constituents. That's how I think about it, at least in terms of Congress. That's how I define it.
Yeah.
And then I'll say one other thing about it, which is that I focus a lot on representation because I see it as kind of like a lot of Congress scholars focus on DC and like regular order and the filibuster and lawmaking and like that end of things and motion to proceed and all this stuff, which I find really fascinating too. And then other scholars focus like very tightly on elections and the district and things like that, which I also really love. Representation is the marriage of those two. It brings them
Mm.
together, right? That that you can't talk about elections without also talking about representation, because that's the choice you're making. And I think, especially in a time when elections are talked about so much in terms of, well, we're just seeing if our team wins or loses, or like who's going to get the majority. Like, is it the red guys or the blue guys? Like, no, you're making a choice about representation, about who's going to try to faithfully represent your interests. And it's done at an
Mm.
individual level, at this district level.
Mm.
And I thinking about representation and reminding ourselves that representation is what it's all about is, I think, really necessary and undervalued both inside and outside of academia in terms of understanding what it is that Congress is actually supposed to be doing, both when they're in Washington and when they're home in their districts. So I know that's a crazy long definition. I'm sorry about that,
No,
but
it's good. I mean, I mean, it's kind of an impossible question, right? I don't think there is a definition. Each representative, I think, theoretically should have their own definition,
yeah.
And they should, probably convey that to their listeners. So I have kind of two follow-ups on that though. Um, First is, are you aware of any institutions that just focus on, representation, the concept of representation, defining it, making it better, the work kind of that you're doing, is it being aggregated by any institutions that you're aware of?
I mean, it's being done by individual scholars and sort of consortiums, groups of scholars who are studying these kinds of questions. But typically it's being done in a more piecemeal way, which has its
Okay.
advantages, right? Because you can specialize. So, for example, one that pops to mind is the Center for Effective Lawmaking. This is the sort of research outfit run by Craig Volden and Alan Weisman. They're both political scientists, both really great guys who have sort of pioneered. They sort of put together an index of their own, much like I did, that is called the Legislative Effectiveness Score. And
Mm.
it's a way of sort of trying to categorize and catalog how effective individual members of Congress are at passing bills into law or advancing their legislation that they like farther down the legislative pipeline, which is one obviously very important aspect of representation. You can be in sympathy with the people all you want, but if you suck at your job in Washington and can't get anything done, then that doesn't matter. It's nice that you have good intentions, but you have to actually be good at the job too. And
Cough, cough,
so
Ron Paul.
no comment. But it's you can't but that's the thing. You can't just scream about it. You got to get there and you got to do something. And so Center for Effective Lawmaking is basically taking that premise and saying, let's try to quantify it. It's not going to be a perfect measure, but it's it's used by members of Congress. Like I remember freaking out in the 2020 Democratic primaries because Amy Klobuchar talked about how high her legislative effectiveness score was in a Democratic debate, and I was like, yeah, political science finally making a splash. And so that's one that springs to mind. I think there are a lot of nonprofit foundations that are really interested in funding projects by academics and non-academics around depolarization, which is a little more specified than sort of representation specifically. But I think it's something that has to be considered when we're thinking about the type of representation we're getting versus where we would like to be. And then I think there's sort of another kind of group of funders who are looking at things like electoral reforms. So stuff I'm sure you know all about, ranked choice voting and open primaries and all these different kinds of reforms that I think are really interesting, that states are trying, localities are trying, but that they need as much study as they can get so that we can understand whether or not they can actually help us achieve better representation. So that's just a few different kind of buckets that I see work in this area kind of falling into.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think about the question of what does representation mean, in some ways it's a conversation, right? It's like somebody that will listen to you. My representative is somebody that would listen to me and then will tell me things back that are not just lies, right?
It's both directions.
It's two directional or bidirectional.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about just the phrase that was at our founding: no taxation without representation. And what the founders were upset about in some ways was that nobody would listen to them, right? It was just that their pleas were going on deaf ears. They were saying, hey, this doesn't make sense, or it seems unfair, or could we push these back, or these sorts of things. And then none of their putative representatives were listening, and so then they wrote a letter to King George and said, hey, our representatives aren't listening, will you please step in? And we all know how that went. And so to me, education seems like it's at the core of representation, right? That in no small measure, the job of a representative is to learn, what his constituents or her constituents believe, think, care about, industries that matter, jobs that matter, the daily realities. And that's why I think somebody who is, on their home turf has an advantage, because they already understand those things. They've been listening to those gripes, their entire life, the barbershop man and this and that. But then there also, I think there used to be this component, which to me seemed basically evaporated in the kind of post-World War I, World War II landscape, which was representatives educating constituents back. Right, that it was two-way, right? You as the representative were amassing all of this information, but then you were going and talking with your colleagues in the House or the Senate, and you're saying, here's what my folks are saying, right? Here's what's important to them on the farm bill. Here's what's important to them on this, that, or the other thing, and then you hear what other representatives think is important or what they're hearing. Here's what Archduke Ferdinand was just assassinated, right? And here's some important information. Here's the information that I have that I can share with you. And it seemed like there was quite a bit of that, right? In the early newspapers, what they did a lot of was like reprinting what the representatives had to say, right? They
Yeah.
were, they would provide a gateway for information, but around the time of kind of radio and TV, it seems like the media landscape changed from representatives educating to kind of the media landscape doing the education, and the representatives kind of taking a back seat and saying, we're just going with what the party says. And I'm obviously overgeneralizing, and so feel free to pick this apart, but it seems like that's continued to, especially as the polarization has increased. It doesn't feel like we have individual members learning or educating their constituents. The only exception I can think in the current Congress on the Republican side, right, it would be like Thomas Massey, right, who they, everyone wants to vote out because he's not in line with, kind of the party message. So I kind of just word saladed at you, but I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
I have more than we have time for probably
Okay.
on this discussion, so I'll just give you a couple. One is that I think, first of all, I don't disagree with anything you said. I think a few important changes over the past few decades, in particular, have brought this around. Okay. One is some of the stuff we've already talked about: the nationalization of politics, the polarization of the two parties, the fact that the two parties, at least in Congress, are more similar within each party. They're more homogenous, right? The average there's not a big distribution of like super moderate or liberal Republicans and then super conservative Republicans. They're all fairly conservative, and then some are more moderate or conservative than others. And then same to some degree on the Democratic side as well. So they're farther apart from each other. They're more homogenous with each other. And what that means is that there is less room for individual legislators, with some exceptions like your Thomas Masseys or your, Bernie Sanders or your, whoever else, like other folks who are sort of big personalities are sort of making their stances known. Backbench sort of members of Congress to make a big impact. And there's been a ton of great political science that has covered this idea that in the chambers, right, in the lawmaking process, and also in the communication process, what you just described, that party leaders have taken advantage of these underlying changes in Congress and consolidated power. And in this case, by power, I mean information. So there's a great book by another University of Maryland graduate a few years before I was, named James Curry, who's going to be at Notre Dame starting this fall. He wrote a great book called Legislating in the Dark, which basically lays out this theory that the average member of Congress, and you probably know this, Walter, but like average member of Congress, like, I hate to break it to your listeners, did not read every word of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or did not read every single word of Obamacare or the Inflation Reduction Act or these other landmark pieces of legislation, right? They relied on their party leaders to give them the information they needed about whether it was the right thing or not to vote on. And it's not that party leaders never have the interests of the people or of their representatives in mind, but they have different goals in Congress than like Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell or whoever, or Mike Johnson, have different goals than the average backbencher member of Congress. And I think that extends as well to political communication. My colleague, who I wrote this textbook with, and who I host my own Congress podcast with, called Highway to Hill, Sorrel Gaynor. She's at UVA. She has a book coming out later this year that I'll send you the. I don't have the exact title off the top of my head, but she wrote, and this was her dissertation. It was all about how that same principle applies to Congress's communication with the public and with their constituents, that they get talking points and messages, and that, like, Congress has been on recess now, as of recording this, for a little while. And so, Mike Johnson gives this set of talking points to his Republican colleagues, saying, when you're home in your districts, talk up all these, benefits of the one big beautiful bill, and like, here's something that it got for your district, and here's all this stuff. And like, it's nice that he wants to help them out, but it is a very top-down approach, and it leaves back like regular members of Congress representing these local constituencies with very little wiggle room and leeway in terms of the type of representation they provide. And at a time when Congress, and this is a whole other topic we could talk about, is
Yeah.
understaffed, under-resourced, lacks the capacity to compete with lobbying firms, much less the president.
Uh-huh.
They have to rely on this information and these messages from party leaders because they don't have the resources, the time, the energy to, come up with all the good things about these bills that they're passing, much less read them in the first place. So that's a combination of a whole bunch of problems, but that I think speaks to some of the things you said.
Yeah. No, it definitely is the case that party polarization. And I remember I read Party Polarization in Congress. I think it was by Sean Thorold in undergrad. And that was an eye opener for me because it really did kind of talk about how, basically these safe districts in the House make it so that, essentially you have to kowtow to the political leaders. Otherwise, you're going to get primaried and you're going to lose. And if you want to do your job, you got to stay in. So then you have to listen to the political leaders. And so then, you kind of end up not representing the interests of your constituents, but the interests of party leaders who, like you said, may have kind of their interests misaligned.
For sure.
Okay. And that will bring us kind of to the solution that I know you understand we are proponents of. But I got one more quick question. Is pork representation?
Yes, I think on the whole it is.
Okay.
I'm excited to know if we disagree on this, if we agree on this or not. I think that on the whole, pork, what I imagine you're referring to, are in the literature typically called earmarks, right? That this is when, typically during the budget process, members of Congress, as part of their kind of horse trading around how to pass pieces of legislation, they will secure individual, either like block grants or funding or things like that for particular projects in their districts. And I think that there are more benefits than drawbacks to using that system. I think it incentivizes members of Congress to work hard to have their voice heard in the legislative process. I think it produces tangible impacts that members of Congress can then point to and say, to help restore trust in the institution and say, look, we did this particular thing. I think it allows those local ties and that local knowledge to shine through rather than the federal government just say, like, I think it's a very sort of decentralized government way of approaching this rather than the federal government just sort of saying like, oh, here's like a total of whatever, $30 billion for infrastructure, and some, cockamamie bureaucratic process will help us decide where it should go, and we're going to spend a ton of money and time and resources on making sure it goes the right. In this case, it's just members of Congress with that local knowledge coming to Washington and saying, guys, here's what we need. If we're going to do infrastructure, here's what we need. And to me, that is beneficial. It can grease the skids in a time where Congress is like hopelessly gridlocked and polarized. I think it can help grease the skids on major legislation. Is it a little shady? Is it a little back, behind closed doors? 100%. I totally get it. But yeah, on the whole, I think that's a good thing. And I think bringing these projects back to their district is, in a way, kind of like vintage representation. But that's just me, maybe.
Yeah, I don't vehemently disagree with you. I think it certainly is representation if it was coupled with, an actual budget process that was, taking in information and not just kind of a rubber stamp of the top-down budget, plus some pork, right? If it was actually kind of the trading for different budget provisions, that I think it would be more representative. And I think, for
Sure.
me, it's always it's kind of a sliding scale, right? I think every member of Congress is in no small measure representative because they were elected, right? So they have to be representative in some way, and they're just worse or better representatives. There was a senator from Montana who was there for a long time, and he was kind of famous for getting so much a lot of pork, bringing in these federal dollars, federal grants into Montana for bridges, roadways, different projects, military, and he was very popular, right? He was a Democrat, and he persisted for a very long time. I think in part because the people did recognize that, on the whole, it's not perfect, but he is bringing money to the state, and that benefits us. And, that is better representation than the guy who brings in no money, cough, cough, Rand Paul. Right? Because, if you don't do any of the horse trading, if you're just Dr. No, you get nothing for your members.
Right.
Okay. So now we got to turn the wheels back. When do you remember where you were when you learned why we have 435 members in the U.S. House?
Yes, I do. It was in in terms of why we there are sort of two instances. One is like learning
Okay.
about the basics of government and like why we have all this stuff, and that was much earlier. But let's see, what was the
Like, why do we have 435 as
Yeah,
opposed, it was in the Constitution? Was it the, when did you learn about the 1929
Right.
Foreign Enforcement Act?
Okay, so this would have been, learned it and internalized it would have been in grad school when I was assigned a book that
Okay.
I am betting you know of or have read, by Brian Frederick, Congressional Representation and Constituents. The subtitle is The Case for Increasing the U.S. House of Representatives. And I was assigned this in my Congress course, sort of upper level course that I took in my early years of grad school. And it's one of the books that I thought it was really well argued. It spent the first couple chapters digging way into this, the Reapportionment Act and like why all the redistricting stuff and why they decided to hold it at that, and then why they decided to keep it at that in the 1920s. And, basically drawing out this argument that, you guys have been talking about and that I, talked about in a couple of recent posts on my Substack of, basically why it's insane that we capped it at 435 and then it's just this straight line for 100 years. And whoops, like we have the same number as we did back then, even though our population has grown many times since then. And I remember that book, like I don't remember every word of it, but I remember it having a big impact on me and really informing how I thought about not just this particular question, which is, as you know, is a favorite of mine, but how I think about representation generally. And like, what does it mean to be a representative of, 200,000 people versus 800,000 people? And like, what does that make more difficult? And it forced me to think hard and critically about a lot of those questions at a very formative point in my career in learning about politics and political science. And so in addition to just getting me sort of hooked on this question of why don't we make the House of Representatives bigger, this book by Brian Frederick and these broader questions about this reform are, even if I'm not thinking about the reform all the time, that it is always informing how I think about representation. So that's where it was.
So this is stunning. We've had, I don't know how many professors and think tankers, and literally the first time this book has been brought to the forefront of my brain. It is
a good
going
one.
to be in my cart. Well, it's literally in the subtitle, right? I mean,
I know.
it would be negligent for me to not read this. So this was a textbook in your grad school. When was it written? Do you remember?
2012, I think. It was part of a series of was it 2012? It was around there. It was fairly recent by the time when I got to grad school, which would have been
Okay.
2014. 2009 looks like it was written.
Okay.
And it's part of this broader, I think, Routledge series on sort of controversies in electoral democracy. And so I think there are other books in this around like uh, in this controversies series around like direct democracy and like
Yeah.
judicial elections and third party candidates and like all these different things. And this was one of them. So
That's fascinating. Do you know, is Brian Frederick a professor here in the States?
Uh, I am not 100% sure.
Okay.
I have not
No
followed a ton
worries.
of his work since then, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But
No, I just I'm gonna have to run him down. The other so one of the first books on representation that was recommended to us was The Concept of Representation by Plotkin, Hannah Plotkin. It was basically, it came out of her senior thesis work at I want to say Berkeley. Um, anyway, it was elucidating, but I have not read a book kind of in the poli sci world making the case. Right? I've read Yuval Levin's work. You know, there are all these books that kind of touch on it, but this is the first one I've seen that is fully dedicated to it. So I'm really
yeah,
excited.
yeah,
I'm
it's not a lengthy one, and it isn't, to your point, like it's not often that like I and as a political scientist, like I try to stay neutral on questions of like officially neutral on questions of reform.
right.
You know, if for nothing else, for the sake of my students to like help them think critically and come to conclusions on their own. I'm not trying to indoctrinate them in any way, certainly not in like a partisan way. But this one, and then you know we can get into this if you want, but particularly the Electoral College are ones that I have a lot of difficulty hiding my displeasure about, and and so you know that sneaks out every once in a while. But you don't typically
Yeah.
get. You're right. You don't typically get these kind of books by you know born and bred political scientists really making a normative case as to why some reform should happen.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you brought up the Electoral College. These are obviously inextricably linked, right?
Of
An
course.
uncap
Yeah.
of the House would change the numbers game for the Electoral College. I wonder if you could
Hmm.
just run through for our listeners, um,
Yeah.
what would that change be? You know, as somebody who looks at the numbers, how would uncapping the House change the Electoral College?
Right. So you know, a nice sort of refresher for folks who have tried to block out previous presidential elections or thinking about them in any way. Let's remind ourselves that, you know, the electoral college, the number of votes, you know, you win the electoral college by winning a majority of electoral college votes. The total number of votes in the electoral college is 538. That's where 538.com came from, for those who don't know. And it's the total number of members of the House plus the total number of members of the Senate plus votes for Washington D.C. and and so you know if you've got that calculus right, it's and so each state's individual number of electoral votes is the total number of their representatives. So in Idaho, that's two, and then the total number of senators, which in Idaho and every other state, that's two. And so we have four electoral votes. If you expanded the size of the House to, you know, somewhere along that cube root curve, let's say, in the sort of 630s, 650s, whatever it would be, then you would add that many votes to the electoral college, the electoral count for electing a president. That's assuming you didn't change anything else about the electoral college. And
Right.
so it would really de-emphasize the Senate side of that equation. It
Mm.
would, you know, and it's up to your listeners whether you think this is a good or a bad thing, but it would, generally speaking, empower more populous states more than they already are in the electoral college process. Or if you want to put it a different way, like it would make the individual votes of people in more populous states more on par with the votes of people in really rural or depopulated states who currently have a lot more voting power in the electoral college. Like
Mm.
the average voter in, especially where you are in Wyoming, has a
Yeah.
lot more like sheer voting power in the electoral college. Their vote counts for a lot more than a
Yeah.
voter in California or Texas or Florida,
Yeah.
because they are, empowered by that equal representation from the Senate side of that equation. And this would add a whole bunch to the more proportional House side of the equation. And I do think it would change. I mean, if you expanded the size of the House, and I should do this at some point, and go back, like if we had like different sizes of the House at different points in American history, different presidential elections, would that have changed the outcome of certain presidential elections? I
Mm.
should I should do that one day. But it certainly would change the nature of presidential elections by empowering bigger states more so than they already are.
Yeah. And it would, I mean, it changes the rules for everyone. I think there's a lot of gamesmanship around the electoral college, right? It's like, well, you don't really need to win the popular vote. You have to win the electoral college, right?
Yeah.
And so you wind up with situations where people win the popular vote, but not the electoral college, or vice versa. And it's confusing, and it is, I think it, creates this break. And one of the problems is that changing the electoral college requires a constitutional amendment,
Yep.
whereas increasing the size of the House only requires a simple bill, as I know
That's
you're
right.
aware. And that's one of the reasons we love it. And it's a way to at least create a stopgap measure to really potentially address some of those concerns. Um, okay, and I realize we are running short on time. Clearly, we have too much in common because we've gotten to
I know we could
zero
talk
of the
about this
news.
for like 20 hours. So
Yeah. Well, I will definitely we'll definitely have you back on, and I wanted to jump to some of your Substacks,
yeah.
and kind of direct people to where they can find out more about you, where to keep in touch. So you've got a website that's your name. You have a Substack. You are here. Where should people interact with you, find you, kind of engage with your work?
I've got a couple of different sort of public facing touch. Like, I assume nobody wants to read like my peer reviewed research articles. Like, they're interesting to me, but they're very boring to read. So I'm not going to point you towards those. Where I
Okay.
will point VP folks to is my more public facing stuff. So there are sort of three things I'll briefly mention here, in order of when they came about. So one is the Substack newsletter you mentioned, which is called You Are Here. It's a little bit, it definitely has overlap with my professional life, but also dabbles in things like, you know, poetry and things like that. I'm interested in questions, both political and non-political, around this overarching idea of place and
Mm.
location and all the different ways that that matters and intersects in our lives. It's kind
Mm.
of the central thesis of my, dissertation and my work in political science, but it's also something I'm really drawn to in terms of reading poetry or other types of culture, movies or things like that. And so I'll write about that stuff there, including some, topics around like expanding the size of the U.S. House or the Electoral College I've written about before. And then I've also written about like Mary Oliver poems and things like that. So depending on what you're interested in, maybe that's attractive to you. Other two projects I'll mention, both of which are podcasts that are much more in sort of the politics realm. One is a podcast I do with my Boise State colleague Jacqueline Kettler, who studies mainly state politics. We have a podcast called Scandalized, which
Mm.
we produce with our local NPR affiliate here, Boise State Public Radio. But it's available on NPR's website. We've done we did our 8 episode first season in 2024, and then a mini season in 2025. We have a full second season coming out later this year. And basically, what we do is we are sort of shameless kind of junkies for political scandals. We look at them not just from the, oh my God, can you believe this guy did this side, but also the political science side. Like, why did like Mark Sanford not have to resign, but Rod Blagojevich did have to resign? Or
Mm.
what are the factors behind all of these things? So we'll tell the story of a scandal, then break it down from a political science lens. We like to tell people Scandalized is the nerd version of celebrity gossip. So that's where sort of we try to come from there. And then the last thing I'll mention is the most recent project of mine, which is called Highway to Hill, as in Capitol Hill, which is like I said, a podcast I co-host with my colleague at UVA, Sorel Gaynor, whose book, by the way, I mentioned earlier, is called Echo Chambers: How Partisan Communication Took Over Congress, from University of Chicago Press. It'll be out later this year, just since I couldn't think of the name earlier. But this podcast, Highway to Hill, it's a weekly podcast about Congress. We cover, one big story of the week in Congress and sort of break it down from start to finish, and then sort of dive deep on like a Congress vocab word, or like something that a contribution we can make to the discussion from a political science lens that helps people understand Congress. We call ourselves sort of an unapologetically pro-Congress podcast. We're very much in the like Article 1 branch of government. It's the founders put it first for a reason. Sort of one thing I will take a side on is sort of like, and this is not a Trump thing or a non-Trump thing, this has been a long-standing thing, but like anti-imperial presidency, Congress needs to be the first branch of government again. And so we look at that stuff from that lens. It's it's a nonpartisan podcast, but we are partisan in that one particular way. So that comes out every Friday, and that's also available on Substack.
I would say you're not partisan. You are elucidating the separation of powers, right? Which is it's not partisan. It is structural.
It shouldn't be anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. You're a structuralist. Well, it's only partisan depending on who's in power.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true.
Well, that's fascinating. I always go back to the power of the purse, the power to lay and collect taxes, the power of the purse, and the power of impeachment, right? I mean, those were these principal powers that were meant to check any other excess of the executive branch. And clearly, those powers have either been degraded or kind of, degraded into this impotence that now kind of leaves the first branch of government really impotent to deal with the executive branch. And it is it's sad. It's a real structural difficulty that we have to deal with.
It is, I think, for a lot of reasons. One, for the reason that we've sort of been talking about this entire time, which is like, we have a Congress that is decentralized and localized in different parts of the country on the suspicion that they understand their localities and their districts better than any president does. And so if you are just sweeping them under the rug, then you're going to lose all these particular local interests and needs of different communities, and just say, oh, we're just going to give it all to the president. Well, the president, I don't care how good of a president they are. I don't care how attentive they are to what's going on in different parts of the country. They can't know their districts better than a good member of Congress could. And that is why we have them in the first place. Well, it's one of the reasons. The other reason is we didn't want like a tyrannical government, obviously. But that's difficult to forget sometimes as well. And then the other thing I'll say is that like the power of the purse, right? Like members of Congress know their districts better than a president does, any president. And I think part of the problem is that like is this sort of politicization or polarization, that when Congress is really polarized, it redounds to the benefit of a strong executive, much in the way that backbenchers power in Congress, when they're really polarized, redounds to the benefit of party leaders in Congress. And that, I think no matter what party you're in, you can sort of say like, that's probably not what like the framers of the Constitution had in mind. And it renders a lot of these powers you just mentioned, including things like impeachment, right? Which I realize is a very tricky topic and it's touchy, but like, and I'm not weighing in on whether impeachment needs to happen now or needed to happen then or whatever. But if impeachment just becomes like a partisan referendum one way or the other, then it's not a power at all. It's just another piece of partisanship. It's not a nonpartisan power that Congress is supposed to check on the president regardless of party if it is merited. And it loses its power. And we've witnessed, I think recently on the power of the purse, that Congress is not willing to establish that prerogative. And I wish they would, because they can do a better job than any president.
Yes, indeed. And it is, I would love, well, I gotta have you back because I want to dive deep. I want to dive deep on a number of topics, but I have to I want to brush on this because I've been talking about it with some of my friends who are former executive branch officials. It's like Congress Congress basically needs the power to spy on the executive branch at this point because it's clear that the executive branch has the power to spy on Congress, members of Congress, staff, um, but really have an in-depth understanding of what's going on in their lives, and to put pressure on them, but also to help get them elected or not in the next election cycle.
Yeah.
And it seems like when you go back and read the history books, some of you know the idea of oversight, right, within Congress, or of select committees, right, in these
Oh
different
yeah.
committee structures that really were meant to have kind of a true Article One power, right? Like if you're going to legislate on something, if you're going to spend money on something, you have to understand it. And we have all of these,
Yeah.
you've got kind of like Epstein circling around in the cloud, and like all of this like UAP stuff, and nobody knows what to make of any of it. And my argument is, look, if you're going to exercise the power of the purse, you have to have the ability to basically really get in and dig in and understand what's going on in the executive branch. And from my perspective, it's just a numbers game, right? When I was on oversight and investigations, there were whatever half a dozen of us overseeing billions of dollars of spend, and on the other side of that equation is an executive branch with thousands of people doing that same work. And so it's an insane amount of work for a limited number of people to do. And that's why I think one of the compelling reasons that we need more legislators is just we need to counterbalance the power of the executive branch. In addition to being better connected to the constituents,
Yep.
you need that balance between
For
those
sure.
branches. So
For sure. Congress is totally outgunned. They have been
yeah,
for a while. And, levels of, counts of staffers in both individual offices and committee staffers have been stagnant for basically decades at this point.
yeah,
And there are a lot of different people whose fault this is. Like, yes, it's Newt Gingrich's fault. Yes, it's other people's fault as well.
right.
Um, but all that while when we say the size of the federal government has grown over the past few decades, we mean the size of the executive branch has grown.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
Congress will not give itself more money. They won't
Yep.
really give the courts more money, but they keep
Yep.
giving these bureaucracies more money, which like
Yep.
lots of great people in the bureaucracy, career civil
Right.
service people
Yep.
doing good
Yep.
work, like CIA, all that stuff. But like
Yeah.
they serve at the pleasure of the president, and that's fine. But like r- again, back to representation. Like at the end of the day, they should be serving at our pleasure.
Yeah.
And if Congress doesn't involve itself, like they are our way in.
Mm.
Congress is our way into all of these important questions, like
Yep.
whether it's stuff like UAPs or Epstein, or like more mainstream issues like AI, right? Like
Right.
if Congress
Yeah.
doesn't legislate in this area, the executive branch is just going to do what it wants. And whether you agree with what the executive branch does or not, like that's not a good thing because it means that we don't have input with the people who we are closest to. Like the president
Yep.
is not going to answer like a handwritten letter from me or like take my call, but a member of Congress might. And that makes a really big difference when we're talking about representation, and when we're talking about like we don't want Congress to hold the president accountable just for fun or just as a thought exercise or just because like, oh well, technically it's in the Constitution so they should do it. Like it's in the Constitution for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Because we knew that a singular executive could like run away with this stuff, especially in a fast changing world like we have today. Anyway, you can tell that this is like the motivating question of my professional life, but I know you get it. So
Yeah. Well, and I think AI is important in this equation, and in one way because a lot of it ends up being top down. And what we're describing, right, is that as the executive branch has grown, essentially what we get are top down decision making, right, instead of bottom up decision making.
mm,
And oh, as I think about the AI race and who we're competing against, principally China, right?
Yeah.
They're top down, right? And that is the way that you can imagine all of that is going to happen, right? And if you step out of line, you sorry for you. And if we're going to win, whatever the competition ends up being, we have to do it bottom up, right? If we take the same top down approach,
It's not going to work for us.
It does not seem like we are going to outcompete the Chinese in
No.
a top down approach. So yeah, I really appreciate having a thoughtful person who has really dug in and done the homework on this. I cannot wait to continue to watch what you do. I'm going to start listening to Highway to Hill for sure, and your other NPR podcast. I forget the name of it now. Say it again.
Scandalized,
yes. Which is, I mean, what a great way to get people interested. And so that was going to be my final question to you, which is, how do we get Mel Gibson to care about representation? I mean, how do we get the people who are just way up in the stratosphere? How do we get this word into the zeitgeist? And I know there's no easy answer to this, but do you have a guess?
I'm sorry to say, I mean, I think it's the answer, but I'm sorry to say that I think it's through the anger. I think like nobody's happy right now with how anything is going. I think that's, and again, that's not like a Trump thing. I think that's been the case for a while. Like nobody was happy during the Biden years. Nobody was happy before that. Like peak frustration with political institutions, with, people can't, especially when thinking about Congress, like their approval rating has been like sub 20% for like 20 years now. And that hurts me as a person who loves Congress. But I understand why. It's because people look at Congress and other political institutions, certainly the presidency, and see something that has nothing to do with them. That is completely different from them. That is like politics has nothing to do with them. It's a conversation that people who like politics have. And I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get involved with that. Yeah. And that's a huge, I mean, that's a generational effort it will take to fix that problem, whether it's civics and all these other things. But this is where I really like representation, because I think it is something that people intuitively understand, even if you, Walter, went up to a random person on the street and asked them the same question you asked me. They were about how do you define representation? It's that old, I was that a Justice Scalia thing of I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, of I know when I'm being well represented, and I know when the people who are supposed to be representing me are ripping me off. And so going back to that as a central organizing principle for whatever reforms we need to have next. And I think basically any American would agree something needs to change. It's going to be difficult to find the things that really motivate people. Maybe it's expanding the House. Maybe it's getting rid of the Electoral College. Maybe it's ranked choice voting. Maybe it's this or that. But or getting rid of gerrymandering. But at the end of the day, I actually think representation is a really strong organizing principle that everyone can get behind, because nobody doesn't want to be represented well, or this is something that everybody wants. We have different ideas about how to get it, but I actually think it's going to help us do whatever we need to do next.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's representation perhaps it's the fundamental unit of account in a representative democracy, and it's agnostic on capitalism or communism, and in some ways it's the bridge, right? It's the fundamental unit of account isn't necessarily, it's not the individual, it's how the individual relates to everyone else, which is also kind of the question of communism, right? You have these two competing economic theories, but both of them actually require quality representation to not end in a totalitarian nightmare. So I am hopeful. You have inspired me to be reinvigorated with, just an understanding that there are smart people who are continuing to work on these issues. And so, really appreciate your time here, Charlie. Really look forward to seeing what you are going to bring forth into the world, and we will be in touch. So, everyone else, thank you so much for being here. I will see you next week, and go check out what Charlie is doing. And we